To caveat.
Well, welcome. It's lovely to see you, Vidika, Lazar, and Aaron Brad Jersak.
Thank you.
We have planned, and my name is David Goa. We've planned a set of 3 conversations. And the first one today will focus on the meaning of the moral life, and also on how so often it turns into a kind of moralism, and where really is the Orthodox tradition in all of that. We are also going to explore a bit in a following conversation how the long-standing understanding of virtue, of excellence, of arete, as the Greeks called it, how that got turned into a preoccupation with values. And then in a third conversation, we will also step back a bit and speak about the whole sphere of ethics and the sphere of the moral life, and provide, I hope, a bit of a more textured way of clarity around those matters. Our intention is for each of these conversations to be initiated by Vidika Lazar. The intention is to speak for 20 minutes, something of the sort, and then for us to engage in conversation and to actually do this within an hour. So Vidika Lazar,
Yes.
You've been concerned about this question of the moral life and what so often happens to it for a long time. So would you lead us into that?
Yeah, it's curious to me how flexible and malleable the concept of morality is, and how often it turns into a concept of simple conformity. Take a look at morality and see
He's giving a talk.
See, when we think about
You recognize him, right?
One moment, we need to mute.
Yeah. Okay, am I there?
Yep.
Well, the conflict between morality and moralism, at the first level, it's morality is what you expect, what you do yourself, what you teach. Moralism is what you expect other people to do, but not necessarily to do yourself. But looking at morality, which our concepts of morality have to come from the inside of an Orthodox Christian concept of morality. It has to come from your conscience, from your heart. It can't just come from obeying a series of rules or regulations. And our understanding of morality changes from time to time. That is, our understanding of what is moral and what isn't moral. We talk about the scripture as a source of morality, but we don't consider it moral to stone women to death for adultery. And we don't consider it a moral thing to stone our children to death if they're unruly. But that is the law. So law isn't necessarily moral. Law is a way of controlling societies and cultures, and controlling really social defense laws to defend and control society. That isn't what morality is, although we often refer to moral laws or moral regulations, and we look to the Old Testament and see what morality was in the Old Testament, and most of the things that were necessary for the survival of the society of the tribe itself, and to move into nationhood from tribalhood, were set by civil laws, and too often those are interpreted as being the moral laws of the Hebrews, but they weren't the really social survival laws, the laws that were necessary to hold the tribe together, to hold the state together. And very often people will look back at those and say, well, this is biblical morality. This is the morality of the Old Testament. And we often confuse the civil laws that are necessary to make cohesion in a tribe or a nation or a local society with a moral structure. But the true morality begins, frankly, with treating everybody around you decently. And that has to come from, to be an actual moral act, it has to come from the heart, come from the inner person, come from some kind of understanding of your relationship with other human beings. Of course, one of the great problems is our alienation itself helps to skew this idea of morality. People talk too much about sin, that's moralism. But sin isn't the real problem. Sin is only a symptom of a greater problem, which is alienation from God, which leads to alienation from our neighbor, from the people around us, which leads to alienation from our own selves. And sometimes we face the great tragedy of being in exile from our own self. But when we look at what our Lord Jesus Christ made as his moral imperatives, the first thing is to have empathy for your neighbor. And the reason Christ would have specifically said, love the Lord your God with all your being and love your neighbor as yourself, is because the basis of our moral quandary or moral problem is that we're alienated from God and we're alienated from our neighbor. That's why Christ, even the parable of the Good Samaritan, who's a neighbor, who is my neighbor? So we're basing our understanding of morality on our relationship with God and our relationship with our neighbor. But it's from an Orthodox perspective, any kind of spiritual life or spiritual manifestation requires struggle. You can't just be following a system of law. You have to struggle to internalize your concepts of your relationship with your neighbor and your relationship with God in order to be have a true core, a true understanding of what morality really is. Morality should govern your relationship with your neighbor and should also govern your relationship with God. It should inform you that the reason we have all of these moral quandaries between us and those around us is because of our alienation. And so we have to look at the moral imperatives of Jesus Christ, and they are moral imperatives. Not one of them is based in law. The first one is based in your relationship with God and your relationship with your neighbor. And then throughout the life of Christ and the teachings of Christ, we find its constant emphasis on relationships. And morality has to govern relationships, but not according to an external law. It has to be something that we internalize. And every truly moral deed has to proceed from the heart, motivated by love or compassion or kindness. And kindness is one of the fundamental bases of true morality. But what's happened is that we've collapsed into an idea that morality consists in a series of laws, rules, regulations that we have to follow. And if we follow those things externally, then we're moral people. It doesn't matter if we follow them when it isn't external. It doesn't matter what's going on in our mind, what's going on in as long as rules and regulations externally. That means that we've converted morality into moralism. And we want to behave in a certain way when other people are watching. But we don't necessarily have that kind of behavior in our conscience or in our heart. We're just following this set of, well, people will judge me this way if I don't behave that way. so I'll behave that way. So people will won't judge me in a negative way. And we're not thinking about our relationship with other human beings, but how other human beings see us, how they see us behaving externally. And that's when morality collapses into moralism, because morality becomes an ideology with aspects to the ideology. And it's different for different groups of people. It's different for different concepts of social cohesion. And that's one of the problems. Then when you are always concerned about other people's behavior, concerned about other people's morality, wanting to dictate to other people how they should behave, and wanting to judge what you consider to be immoral without any substance to your considerations. This is moralism. This is the problem that Christ brought up with the Pharisees, of course. They would demand certain behavior of other people, but they didn't necessarily behave that way themselves. But in public, they would make their phylacteries long and say long prayers in public in order to be seen as following the law. But that really isn't what morality should consist in. Morality requires an inner human struggle. It requires a transformation or the inner human person. And of course, that's basic to orthodoxy. We're always struggling for this inner transformation. And true morality has to be something we sincerely believe and sincerely follow, but it has to be measured by our actual relationship with God and with other persons. Moralism is the things we do externally to seem to be moral people, the kind of behavior we demand of other people without necessarily knowing their circumstances. When we talk about moral behavior, we'll say, oh, somebody who takes drugs, they're immoral. Well, not necessarily. Very few people start taking drugs because they wake up one morning and say, gee, I feel really immoral today. I think I'll start taking drugs. That's not what happens. So we have to think about this idea of moralism is saying, well, okay, this prostitutes on the street, for example. They're a bunch of immoral women. Well, not necessarily. No woman wakes up one morning and says, gee, I feel really immoral today, so we'll move into a flea-ridden fire trap in the East End and get in a car with some man who might murder me or give me a unmentionable disease. He'll give me $50. I'll come back and my pimple slap me around and take it from me. But I'm feeling really immoral today, so that's the kind of lifestyle I want. See, but when we are judging, condemning other people without even concerning ourselves with their inner human suffering that they might be going through, with the tragedies of their life, with the traumas of their past, and the traumas of their life today, and not taking into account how that affects their manifestations of their behavior. And we just say, oh, well, they're just doing that because they're immoral. That's moralism. True morality would say, I wonder what kind of tragedy or trauma is driving that person. I wonder if there's anything I can do to help them out of this. I wonder if there's any way I can influence their life for the better. Now that would be a moral relationship with your neighbor. But judging and condemning without even trying to know the conditions of the other person's life is moralism. And we do that so often. To think that everyone can respond in the same way to the situations that face them, to think that they don't have inner traumas, inner torments, inner conflicts that are going on. But the real immorality is what we do to hurt the other person, or what we do to condemn or judge the other person. That's genuinely immoral. But it's actually moralism. I'm the perihelion of morality, but so everybody who's not like me is immoral. Everybody who can't live up to my standards is immoral. And setting ourselves, I think the supreme hypocrisy is to make ourselves the model of what we believe morality should be, and making ourselves the pattern by which we judge other people. And that's when morality collapses into moralism, when we don't involve our relationship with our neighbor and our neighbor's circumstances and situations as the basis of our understanding of other people. In any given time, the social morality, which it's all around us, we don't necessarily agree with social morality, but it's different from one decade to another. It continually fluctuates. I read in the 1950s, people being scandalized because one of the protagonists in a movie told someone to go to hell. And everybody was outraged by that because that was something you didn't express in public. And they thought, well, our morality is collapsing. But you see how we are now in this decade. So our social morality is not something to set any kind of spiritual standards by. That morality does require assimilating what we think is proper relationship with our neighbor, first of all. And what is our proper relationship with society around us? Are we contributing to it or helping to tear it down or make it drift to the worst? And it's what we do with ourselves, in ourselves, and about ourselves, first of all. Morality is how we try to shape our own hearts and consciences and our own behavior in relationship to our neighbor, in relationship to society around us, and our relationship to God, of course. So we don't just say, well, here are a set of moral rules. If you follow these, you're moral. Because you can also, like people around you, be just fulfilling them externally. But it doesn't resonate in your heart, your sort of moral behavior. And if it's not coming from the heart, if it doesn't resonate in your heart, then it's just some kind of moralism. It's a set of rules and regulations that say that we should all be sort of identical in the way we act and the way we think. And they're just can become a kind of control mechanism by which we try to control other people. And that's when it's moralism. It's something we want to inflict rather than an example that we want to set by the quality of our own lives and our own relationships with other people. That's the one missing dimension in this whole concept of, you see, televangelists saying, oh, God loves everyone. Now here's a list of people you have to hate. Here's a list of people you have to despise. Here's a list of people that God hates, but God is love. Here's a list of people that you should condemn for their behavior, but God is love. That's moralism. And one of the worst aspects of this corrupt moralism is the way we can judge and condemn other people, pretend against a moral judgment, out of in ignorance, not even desiring to know anything about their traumas and struggles and pains, and not even desiring to know what forces are driving their behavior, and not caring. In addition, I see that so often here. Tonight we have our Narcotics Anonymous group, and how often we'll hear from one of these people who's really struggling desperately to keep away from narcotics now, to recover from it. But there's somebody in the family or people won't want anything to do with them because they're immoral. because they're taking drugs, using narcotics. Now, as an example, on one occasion we had a girl here who'd been sexually abused by two brothers and their two friends when she was 12 years old. How are you going to judge her behavior as being immoral without understanding what kind of enormous trauma that she went through that reshaped her life, reshaped her concept of herself, reshaped her concept of her relationship with other people? So that's the first way I would define a difference between morality and moralism, is that we can so handily judge and condemn somebody for what we perceive as their moral behavior without even caring about what kind of suffering they may be going through, without even caring about what kind of trauma they must be reliving over and over again. Because again, we relate this to the word sin, and sin just isn't the main problem. It's our alienation that's the problem. And our alienation from our neighbor is a good part of it. But sin is just a symptom of that alienation, particularly our alienation from God, of course. But I don't know how I can explain this very clearly, but if our moral behavior isn't coming from the heart, isn't coming from our conscience, then we're just being conformist. We're not being moral people, we're just being conformist. And we're conforming to whatever system presents itself to us at any given time. We obey the law. So that doesn't make us moral people. It makes us afraid of punishment if we don't obey the law. That's at the law of self-preservation kicking in. But moral behavior has to be motivated from our own hearts and our own consciences in a way that thinks of, how am I relating to my neighbor? How am I relating to the people around me? And I want to conduct my behavior in such a way that I don't hurt anyone, I don't harm anyone, I don't cause anybody some serious grief or trauma myself. It's not just that I want everybody to behave according to a die-cut system. And when we think that way, we think, well, if everybody's like me, they're moral people. Because see, I'm the criterion for moral behavior and what is moral. And when we're projecting outward our judgment or condemnations of what's moral and what's not moral, then that really is moralism. True morality would demand that we know something about a person before we judge them, that we know something about what they're going through, what motivates their behavior. Yeah. And that would be something that was genuinely moral. And just projecting our disdain for someone outward is a kind of moralism. And,
so Viveeka, I think you've laid out a number of pathways there. Yeah. So can I raise a couple things with you and see if we can explore them together?
Yeah, that'd probably be better.
So one of them that strikes me, my own sense is that all of us who are parents, whether we think of it as having sort of moral absolutes or not, we have some very serious moral guidelines that we want to exercise around our children. And we do that because we don't want our children harmed, even before they're adults. And ideally, we want to do that so that when they are adults, they will not be bearing wounds that are so deep that they won't actually be able to mature into adulthood. Yes. So my sense is that part of the struggle here and what you've identified with this term moralism and people that are stuck there, part of it is that it strikes me as a failure to mature, a failure to move out of what really is very common in young teenagers. Young teenagers are highly moralistic, typically, very moralistic, because they're trying to find the edges of the world. So, and certainly in what you've said about the Christian understanding is that the issue isn't the moral framework, the issue is human transformation.
Yep.
So, but the part of it that I want to press a little bit here, you know, it's easy for me to make judgments about other people's moralism. And, you know, I'm convinced I'm right about that too. But isn't it also the case that for those who suffer from moralism, and we can think of parts of the church, parts of our own church, parts of other churches suffer from moralism, and they get locked in that. This also is a form of suffering, is it not? It's a form of suffering. So then the question I have is this: are there ways, can you think of how one might reach in to that form of suffering, which is in fact moralism and is full of judgment and drawing lines in the world that are unnecessary and not being open to the other? Do you see ways within our spiritual tradition of seeking to help people who suffer from moralism to actually wake up and be aware of the world?
You know, we can rather try that, but it, let's say for when you're trying to influence your children, you're not just trying to influence them to follow a system of law. You're really trying to influence them to internalize that moral structure and to make it, from an Orthodox point of view, it's constant struggle. It's constant struggle to do that because we're all tempted to moralize at times. And so we have to always be struggling with it. And of course, people who have become locked into moralism, it's sometimes based in fear. You know, they're afraid of things that are different, things that aren't being done by a precise recipe, and trying in a way to help people overcome their fears is a good part of it, because so much of how we respond around us is really the instinct for survival instinct, and we're afraid of the different, we're afraid of the unusual, and because we feel threatened by it, and our instinct kick in. But I would say our passion, of self,
when I think of the moral majority in the United States and here in Canada, and the political role it played, and my own sense of how unfortunate that was, and my sense of how unfortunate it was precisely because those of us that took exception to some of what the moral majority was saying, that we did not seek to understand the fear that drove that. And my sense is, you put your finger here on what the issue is for us, how to have that kind of compassion to understand what's behind that. What's behind moralism? What's the fear there? And try to find some way, not simply to oppose them with our own moral system or with counters, but to try and find some way to pour the oil of gladness on that fear.
You know, one thing we have to completely separate morality from civil law, because we talk about moral laws. What are moral laws? But the laws aren't moral. The laws are there for the defense of the culture and the society. They're what the legislators, at least, feel are necessary for a cohesion in the society and the culture itself. And those things they have to legislate, and they sometimes get called moral laws. But morality has to be based in our interhuman relationships and how we relate to other people. And fear is at the base of so much of religion. That fear is propagated by so much of the religious systems that really, in a way, are even the part of Christianity that's disconnected itself from Christ and has now taken the shape of the legislator who wants to legislate what they think is necessary for social cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
That it's focused on I, my, and me, or our association or our denomination, rather than being focused on what our relationship is with our neighbors. And every time, I remember reading old newspapers from the time when women were marching for suffrage to be able to vote. And it recalled in, I think in the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken, it was called one of the most perverse notions to afflict humanity was women getting to vote. It was worded in those terms. It was a perverse affliction on humanity for women to want to be equal with men and to vote and to be able to own their own money and have their own bank accounts and things. So it was just because it was so contrary to what people were used to, and it struck fear in them because, women were irrational and immature throughout their lives, and they had to be protected by men. And all of a sudden, women wanted to be independent. Oh my God, a horrible society will collapse. The Antichrist will appear, and if women get to vote. So every time something new comes along that emerges in society, it's always been there, but it's been held down. But every time it emerges, then there's a panic. There's a kind of, and I would say a moral panic, because this is new, therefore it's immoral. This is novel, something we hadn't had to face before, therefore it must be immoral. And to project that without even trying to discover the realities of the matter. You make medical breakthroughs. You see the almost hysteria about vaccines sometimes. Well, it was there when the vaccine for smallpox came along. There was great resistance too among some people. And the vaccination for measles, somebody started the absolute ludicrous story that it causes autism, and we know that autism is a matter of proteins and has nothing to do with anything like that. But it emerges and it's new, it's different, it's not what you're used to, it's not what you grew up with as a child, so it must be immoral. So, but
I have another.
I'm trying to say educating people is extremely difficult for people who don't want to be educated, for people who are locked into ignorance also, or for whom ignorance is a doctrine of the faith. But trying to educate people about other human beings and their condition, the things that are different from you, the things that are new developments in medicine and science, well, that does it not just fear, but it kind of panics some people. And they began to moralize about even advances in medicine, or any advances in science, or any advances in the knowledge of the human person. We have an anthropology that was formed from 500 by the 500s. Our anthropology was pretty well formed, religious anthropology, understanding of men. But our knowledge, not just understanding, but our knowledge of humanity has changed so dramatically over the centuries now as we progressed, as we had our reality tunnel opened up before us because we had microscopes, telescopes, and functional MRI and things like this, that all of those developments are so frightening to people that they moralize them too. And it's still, to me, the basis of our morality has to be our coming out of alienation with other people and with God, but also being open to change our understandings when there's a good reason to change them, to change our moral concepts when there's a good reason to change them. and not to judge everything that's different, everything that's not us, everything that, I mean, in the early 50s, it was your haircut that made you immoral. If you had a flat top, you were a scoundrel until Elvis Presley came along. And then if you had a flat top, you were one of the good guys because everybody wanted Elvis Presley haircut. But that was a moral judgment that was really prevalent in that at that particular time. And that's moralism. You want to make a moral judgment on everything that's new or that you encounter for the first time without examining to see what's the basis of it or what's behind it. It seems to me that if you're a really moral person, you care about the other person and what's driving their behavior, what's driving their actions, rather than just putting your foot on their head and shoving them back down into the darkness.
I think you really made that very clear, and it's so central. There's this expression, I first heard it from Yaroslav Pelikan, which I always found rather charming, which is that Jesus Christ was always more than a moralist, and he was never less than a moralist. Jesus Christ called us to forgive as no moralist would, and called us to respond to the world out of transformation, which is far greater than any moralist would be concerned with.
I think
so. It's trying to get at that central matter, which is you can live a moral system and you can live the law, and that all may be fine, but that's not the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is that inner transformation you've talked about, which makes it possible for you to be present to those that are genuinely different than you and who you may not understand.
Yeah. Well, I think the significance of some of the actions of Christ maybe, I didn't need to do more of this or that, but not really understood well enough. It's one thing that a person with leprosy is unclean. They can't enter the temple. Indeed, they have to stay across Gehenna, the valley of Gehenna, but can't enter the holy city. They're untouchable. But Christ puts his hand on the head of the leper. He touches him.
Yeah.
And that's why even if we only mentally reach out and touch the person we don't understand.
Yeah.
We reach out and touch the person that we think is unclean.
Yeah.
And try to, if we reach with our heart and touch them.
And if we let them touch us.
Yeah.
And let them touch us.
Yeah.
And I think that's so often the more difficult part of it. We can touch people with charity, but we don't open our hearts to them and be touched by them and transformed by them as well.
Yeah,
so I'm wondering,
the cup, but disdain the person.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if there are others who are with us who would like to think out loud a little bit and perhaps raise things, but share their thoughts. Are any of you wanting to?
How do you figure out
speak up at the table?
I need to see about unmuting people. Actually, why don't you, if you want to put your questions into the chat or comments into the chat, but I
prefer to hear people directly.
Okay.
But I don't,
Well, if they can
raise their hand or something.
Yeah, I'm going to. Well, I have some questions or thoughts, and then I'm gonna pull in some of the people that have already been active in the chat. So for me, this is of great concern in terms of the Sermon on the Mount, which in some ways I see as a moral vision of the kingdom of God, where I see the struggle in Matthew 5 that Christ is calling us to internalize the law, that it's not simply sufficient to refrain from murdering or committing adultery, for example, but there's a call then to internalize that such that there's that we're transformed out of hatred and out of lust and so on. So I see him bringing an internalization there. Now in the tradition I grew up in, there was great paranoia about actually obeying the Sermon on the Mount, although it ends with Christ saying, here's the wise person who builds their house on rock, the one who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. But we were so paranoid that this would become moralism or legalism or works righteousness that we actually we created it was like a theory of grace where it's like, well, Christ doesn't actually invite you to obey these things. He wants you to know it's impossible, so you'll cast yourself in the grace of God. And that was Bonhoeffer's critique of Luther, whether he's overstating it or not. But he's like, even that Bonhoeffer's read of Luther was that if you try to obey the Sermon on the Mount, you're a moralist and you have actually renounced the grace of God. And he's like, that's just not right. But this does become, the Sermon on the Mount does become a great test case for how to read it as the moral imperatives of Christ versus moralizing the same sermon and misusing the Sermon on the Mount. And at times Tolstoy, for example, was accused of this, that he's moralized the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm like, well, maybe, but also he was watching how the church was not living according to the social revolution of an internalized heart of love towards the other, and he was calling us on it. So I'd be curious about your comments on that, a moral approach versus a moralist approach to Christ's great sermon.
Well, I don't know why people make such a big deal out of the 10 Commandments. They're really rather insipid and don't say much, but and they don't convey very much. I mean, Hammurabi was centuries before the 10 Commandments, and he said the same thing. And Egyptian law didn't allow you to go around killing people or stealing, and so it didn't give us anything new except saying, to have only one God, not to have idols. But the Sermon on the Mount is never posted in any city hall, but the 10 Commandments were. The 10 Commandments are not transformative. They don't call for any kind of transformation. They just call for sameness.
It's that tribal boundary you were talking about.
It's a tribal boundary, yeah.
Yeah.
But the thing is that, how can anyone read? See, the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel was just not just about feeding the hungry, and you didn't feed me, but it starts with it's 3 interlocked parables. St. John Chrysostom asks us, what there were the wise and foolish virgins. The foolish virgins had no oil for their lamp, so they couldn't enter with the king. So John Chrysostom says, what was the oil that was missing from the lamps of the foolish virgin? He said, the oil of humanity was what was missing from it. So it gets to the point where you think so much about salvation by grace through faith without any works. We're not saved by works, but he doesn't say don't do any works. You have to do you're called upon to be transformed by divine grace. And you can't be transformed by divine grace unless you're manifesting that transformation in life. And Christ is clearly, after he enjoins us about then burying the talents, not letting the grace flow back out of us to others, which is how you invest it.
Yeah, grace does generate a transformed life, doesn't it? I mean, it does something. It's not ineffective.
If you have grace, it has to flow out of you to others.
I'm going to ask.
There's the old. I'm sure I didn't make up the story. It's been around, but fresh water flows into the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee is alive, full of fish, full of providing life for everybody around it. Then it flows into the Dead Sea and becomes dead. It flows, the Sea of Galilee is alive because the water flows back out. The Dead Sea is dead because the water can't flow out. And that's precisely the way your faith is.
Yeah.
If this grace and this transformation of the things of that Jesus Christ taught us aren't, we take them into us, but they have to flow out again, or they just stagnate within us, and they become like the Dead Sea. But that Christ wouldn't have given the Sermon on the Mount if he didn't intend for us to learn from it, and he intended for it to set a pattern of true morality and true life. And the same thing with the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. You have to understand all three of those parables as being interlocked. They're not freestanding parables, they're all interlocked.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, it doesn't matter how much faith you had, if you completely ignored other human beings and ignored their plight, totally didn't care about them, then Christ will say, "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity, I never knew you." It doesn't matter how much faith you have, how much grace you claim to have. If you didn't do anything, it all stagnated and died within you. Depart from me, I never knew you. And not that Christ would shun anybody off, but it's just that they wouldn't be able to respond to him.
Yeah.
He's describing the condition they're already in.
Yeah. Our friend Peter Bell is ready to join in with audio at this point. He doesn't have video working, but Peter Bell, why don't you go ahead and share your thoughts or questions, responses?
Thank you. I was noticing one of my daughters is a theater major. She has a degree in theater, and she's going for graduate work in Shakespeare. And I was just noticing that in all of literature, the Greek literature and our own literature and all of Scripture, the main activity is this agonia, this struggle for getting it right, for having an internal witness of the law of God written on your heart. And to me, that's the interesting thing, even in entertainment, but even more so in life. Vladika said that we're supposed to be interested in what's motivating our neighbor. And I think that's the most interesting thing there is anyway, is what's happening on the inside.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that I find over decades now, because I was on the suicide hotline for years, and I've been dealing with people who are drug addicted for a long time, trying to struggle to overcome that. And when I go into the Narcotics Anonymous meeting, realizing that everybody there cares about everybody else there and understands everybody else there, because they've all been in the same situations. They understand each other's trauma and each other's pain, and they're there to help pick each other up. And we, when one of us falls, the rest of the Christians around us should pick us up, so that we'll be standing to help pick them up when they fall. Because we all will, and we all do, and we all need each other's solace and consolation at times. Then I see a beautiful pattern of this with these people who have been, some ended up in crack houses and even lost their teeth and everything. Then a young lady who started celebrating her 5th anniversary of being free of drugs also went back to college and graduated with honors. Whereas before, she had been on the street in the East End of Vancouver, being judged and condemned for her moral condition, without anybody knowing not only what kind of trauma put her there, but what she was capable of, graduating from college with honors. And I've seen that so many times in so many people.
Did you want to go further with that, Peter?
Well, I would just say, in response to that, it's kind of almost a cliche that the AA meetings and the NA meetings have become more like church than some of what our religious church is.
Truly,
That
truly.
almost goes overboard in that, but there's definitely something to that, I think.
I don't think it's even particularly overboard, and I'll tell you why. When the readings at the beginning of the meeting, it says we tried several things, including religion, and it didn't help. And the reason it
Right.
didn't help is because religion moralizes instead of looking at the actual human being and finding out how they can help the human being, instead of saying, well, it's immoral, stop doing it. Well, I mean, somebody could say that. I even had the parent once, I was at a schizophrenic person staying here. She says, why didn't he just straighten out and get his life back on track? I says, because he is schizophrenic, But why didn't he just straighten out? Okay, why doesn't the person who's, by whatever means, become addicted? Why don't they just stop like that and just don't do it anymore? Well, because it's a disease. It's not a moral problem.
Yes.
Not a moral issue. It's a disease, and it has to be treated like a disease. It's treated like a disease. It's not curable, but it's
Right.
treatable if the people are willing, if people around you are willing to actually help you through it. But so often they'll go to church, and the church will put their hand on their head and scream some horrendous prayers and hop up and down across the stage and scream at people. But they're just going to judge the person. They're not going to give them the support they need. And of course, part of it is because they don't understand. And I don't blame the people for not all understanding. I blame people for not trying to understand, for not seeking to understand. They're not seeking to know what, it's what we think is a moral issue. Is it really a moral issue, or is it a disease like drug addiction? Or is it some dreadful trauma that I probably couldn't even cope with myself, but they're having to cope with it and live with it? And is that what's driving their condition now? I mean, we're not talking about psychopaths. That's a problem of the medial prefrontal cortex. But even that is a peculiar kind of evil, because it happens to be motivated by a silent medial prefrontal cortex and an overabundance of dopamine production. So is that a moral problem, or is it a disease? Okay. We have to think more deeply about all of these things. But when I see people interacting in a way where they're dedicated to helping each other because the other are helping them, and they're all together, understanding that they're all together, and they're all responding as a group to each other's suffering, to each other's trauma, to each other's desperation, and they're helping to lift one another out of that. And you see somebody who's taken celebrating the 30th anniversary of being free of drugs, still coming to the meeting, still being equal to everybody else in the meeting. And too often, I mean, I wish we had more parishes that were that way, or more communities, church communities that were that way. That we see each other and try to be there, not to judge each other or notice whether the other person's hairdo is nice, or whether they're wearing too expensive a jewelry or something, and actually be there for each other in the time when each other has a real trauma, a genuine trauma.
I think we still have time for Radu.
I'd like to respond, Vadika, just a moment to what Peter said about, and what you've been saying about AA, and wishing there were more churches like that. I mean, my sense is that in what you've said, Peter, and in what Vadika describes as AA, where people are together, where people help other people, whether they know each other or not, that is the ecclesia. That is the kingdom. That's where it is. And it would be nice if it's in the church, and sometimes it is in the church, but we must not confuse the church with where the kingdom is. The kingdom occurs, as Jesus Christ makes so clear, it occurs in all of these places. So it is a cliche, alas, but it's also a profound truth.
Yeah.
If the kingdom of God isn't in your heart, you're not anywhere near it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But the thing is that I don't even know what I was going to say. I forget.
Let's jump in with Radu. He's been waiting to
Couldn't find
ask or comment. Why don't you,
Okay.
fresh from the Golden Gate Bridge, we have Radu G.
No worries, I can. No worries, I have patience. Rodika, bless. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor David, Brad. I have a question. Actually, I have two. One is it possible to become moral, to be moral without a transformed heart and mind? And second, how can we make the transition from moralism to morality in our lives, in our churches? Because we so often, sorry, please go ahead.
Well, simply we have, if we haven't internalized it, but we haven't taken it into our heart, it's questionable to me whether it can be called morality instead of moralism. I mean, just conformity isn't morality. At least it isn't the morality of Jesus Christ. It's the morality of the world, I suppose, but not the morality of Jesus Christ. I mean, I'm sure that the Levite and the priest who passed by on the other side were very moral people, but they weren't going to help the man in the ditch who was bleeding to death. But the outsider, the outcast, of course, the Samaritan, he was actually moral. He responded in a truly moral way. He cared about the other person, and he cared about his welfare, and he went far out of his way to help him. But the priest and the Levite were probably very, very moral people. But they were totally immoral, actually. In actual fact, they were moralistic, but they weren't moral. Because morality would have drawn their hearts straight to the man in the ditch.
And we see where the morality shows up where we least expect it, where it surprises us, right? So it's in the other, even in the enemy other, we may see evidence of this kind of transformation that is evidence of the kingdom of God, of presence in communion. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought you had to get baptized first. It's like, well, surprise.
Well, there's a misunderstanding of baptism we should talk about one day too. But my first teacher, Father John Romanides, who was my mentor actually, he used to tell us, we know where grace is, but we do not know where grace is not. We can identify, okay, there's grace here, there's grace in the Orthodox Church and all, but it's not our judgment where else grace might appear, where else grace might touch. So we know where grace is, but we don't know where grace is not. That's the thing. And we have to be careful about trying to, think God's thoughts for him. People say, what would Jesus do? It says, what would Jesus do? And you're going to tell me what Jesus would do, aren't you? Because you're thinking Jesus's thoughts for him. And you know what you think Jesus ought to do. But, the grace of God flows for its will. We can't set limits or boundaries to God's grace. And so when we do that, we're already not moral people. The idea that we're saved by faith through grace, it really was one that Bonhoeffer was correct, because it really was one of the problems that, well, now we can't do any works of any kind because that's works. And that's not what Apostle Paul commanded. He also listed any number of works that we needed to do. And living our life as works. How we live our life depends on works. You can't just say, oh, I have faith, now I'm saved, and now I don't have to do anything. I can just sit back and just have an empty-headed mindlessness because I'm saved now, because I don't have to worry about whether anybody suffers or whether there are wars or whether people are murdered or whether people are killed, any of that. Because I'm saved by grace through faith. So I can have, but I question whether that's even faith.
So did James.
It's just a cop-out. It's not faith. You say, oh yeah, well, see, I have agreed, I have an agreement with Christ. I agree to believe in him and therefore he's obligated to save me. That's what it really boils down to.
I would like to respond a little bit to Radu's query here. You know, my sense is that the vast majority of people seek to live a moral life as they understand it. And the most moral people that I know, the most moral people that I know are atheists. And they live extremely disciplined moral lives. And I admire that. And I laud that. And I say, may the God you don't believe in bless you, you know, in that. I think living a moral life is so valuable. And of course, many of the church fathers and spiritual mothers teach us about how the moral life is necessary as part of the discipline in order to become holy. But I would suggest, I think there's confusion around the term. My own sense is that in the Christian tradition, and orthodoxy so clearly is really trying to, on the one hand, affirm the gifts of the moral life, but it is also saying to us, when your life is transformed, when your heart and your mind is made new, when you have the mind of Christ, it is not the moral life that is in your purview. It is the image and likeness of God in every single human being you meet. And so your relationship to them is no longer within any, no matter how good a moral paradigm, your relationship to them is that they are Christ among us.
You know, if you can't see the image of the living God in everyone around you, you'll never see the face of the living God in eternity. You won't, because this is a thing that we keep asking what is grace, and we could get carried away in trying to explain the energies, divine energies, but it is an energy that God implants in you. It is, you know, energy is more than just the ability to do work. Energy is communication, and if God implants a grace in you, he's giving you the energy, the strength to be other than you were before, to change, to transform, to become something that you weren't before you received it. And part of that is, if we receive the grace of God, we have to project that grace outward. But here's the thing, humanity is essentially good. And Calvin had it wrong. People aren't born depraved, people are born essentially good. And mankind is essentially good. As Romanides would say, that evil is like a parasite on humanity, but it's not the nature of humanity. But even in our fallen state, we're still the image and likeness of God. And restoring that image is part of what our struggle is really all about.
The struggle is all about.
Yeah, because when Satan, you know, the story in the Garden of Eden is too bad that people take it literally, because it really expresses so much. It's the story of our becoming alienated from God, but also we're the image and likeness of God. Satan says, if you disobey God and cease loving him. You can become like God. So it's the birth of ego in the first place, ego and selfness, and which is at the root of most human problems. And so you go into this alienation, you fall into this ego, you take a counterfeit for something from Satan, for something God has already given you. But nevertheless, everyone is the image and likeness of God. People aren't born evil. We certainly not born depraved. And to see that humanity is essentially good. I mean, humanity has a will toward the good. They don't go around trying to harm each other, plotting and planning ways to hurt each other. You have to, that has to be assimilated. That's like a parasite of some kind. If people start doing that, but it doesn't mean that humanity is not born good. So humanity is born essentially moral. We have to learn all of the immoral things. You know, sometimes when I baptize a baby, I tell the parents that the child is now absolutely pure. They have no prejudice, they have no hatred, they have no malice, they have no evil thoughts. You're going to have to teach them all that. And so, you know, make up your mind. Are you going to teach them that? Is that what you're going to teach them? So, you know, we pass on wickedness on to the next generation that way. Yeah, through instruction.
Well, thank you, Vedika, for opening up this for us.
Okay.
And I think we will be, we'll let you all know when we do our next, invite you to our next conversation.
Yeah.
It's lovely to see you and to engage in your thinking.
Yeah, I was pleased to see that my friend Petros Vassiliadis was here for a little while. I think he's gone now, but he's a great teacher.
Thanks so much, Vedika.
And we will post this on clarionjournal.com. I believe it's clarion-journal.
Yeah.
Clarion-journal.com. It should be up within 24 hours. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Irene. Bye-bye.
God bless everyone.
Yeah.